My name is Luciana Duranti, and I am the director of the InterPARES project. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are broadcasting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. The documentary you are about to watch has been produced by the Canadian Institute for Information and Privacy Studies, which exists to expand public knowledge of freedom of information and privacy issues in Canada through programs of research and education, and by InterPARES Trust, an international multidisciplinary research project exploring issues of trust and trustworthiness of records and data in an online environment. The InterPARES Trust goal for the past 6 years has been to generate the theoretical and methodological frameworks to develop local, national, and international policies, procedures, regulations, standards, and legislation in order to ensure public trust grounded on evidence of good governance and a persistent digital memory. We are very well aware that the records and archival community holds public trust for the management and preservation of the records through which governments are held accountable by the people they serve, the current and future generations. We take such a responsibility very seriously on the assumption that records will result from each activity as a natural byproduct of them. We used to talk about the inherent virtue of the innocent records created by an organization for its own operations, not designed for researchers, but the instruments of actions and decisions, the most reliable evidence of such actions and decisions because of their being means to an end rather than the end itself, a residue of activity comparable to the bed of a river, revealing its course and the life in and around it. So many metaphors like this have been associated with records, precisely because they're meant to be produced as part of the routine functions of any well-managed organization. With the advent of the digital environment, the records became ubiquitous, existing in multiple copies in different places and easier to access. Because of this, and as a consequence of freedom of information laws, records creators have become aware in a supremely self-conscious manner of their own records. They have figured that the records could not be left for others or for chance to determine their future. They are too significant politically, legally, and socially, and the time for accountability through them could come any moment, here and now, 4 days or 4 years from now, or 300. Yes, historical accountability will also come. Thus, the records have lost their innocence, and sometimes also their existence. The documentary you are about to see was created to shine a light on this problem, which is very troubling and growing across the world. At the time when the digital environment can give more access to government actions and decisions than ever before, critical records that must be created and maintained by governments as the foundation for further action, for reference, for accountability, and for transparency purposes are disappearing from public view. Our 17-minute documentary focuses on the situation in British Columbia, Canada, but it serves as an example and a lesson everywhere there are governments who aim to keep secret both their actions and their motivations, and citizens who wish to know that their governments really do what they really do and how they reach such decisions. The video will be followed by question and answers period featuring an expert panel which will take your texted questions. This event is being recorded for educational purposes and will be available to you all on our website. We would like to extend special thanks to the documentary brilliant director, Dwayne Beaver, and the amazing professional team he put together to produce it. Dwayne currently teaches full-time at Capilano University Motion Picture Arts School of Communication and in Indigenous Independent Filmmakers Program. But he found the time to work with us to create what we hope will be an eye-opening message for our times. And now our documentary, Duty to Document.
Just about everything that the government does should be open to public examination and scrutiny. And it should be available now, not 4 years from now. So it's really, really important for us to have a documentary record and to make it accessible.
We should be always erring on the side of retention because government's tendency is towards secrecy and is towards destruction.
Have things improved in terms of recent years? I don't think they have. I think it's worse now than it's ever been.
It's really important for government agencies to manage the whole life cycle of records and information. And that means policies at the beginning, at the creation stage, to make sure that the right information is created, that records are kept of important and critical decisions, and that they're retained and made accessible to the public. So these are really important and fundamental to citizens being able to contribute to society, to citizens being able to participate in an informed way to public debate.
In 2009, there was a controversy over the HST. And of course, at that time, there's a big push from the federal government to try and harmonize sales taxes. So you could assume that if Gordon Campbell is going off to a First Minister's meeting, they're not sending him over there without all kinds of detailed stuff. We asked for a copy of a briefing binder, and this contains notes on absolutely anything that could come up. We assumed that they would cut it to pieces. What we didn't expect is a letter back saying there are no records responsive to your request.
Public servants need to understand that they're trustees of public records. They're holding these records on behalf of the public.
Members of the Legislative Press Gallery put in a joint request with the Ministry of Finance looking for generally the same stuff. It was there.
The purpose of the Freedom of Information Act are really to ensure accountability in government agencies, giving individuals a right, a general right to access records about government decision-making and also to access their own personal information.
Some people want to know what the nursing home that their grandma is in is like. They want to know what the inspections are like. So we talk about you could file a Freedom of Information request for inspection reports from the health authority. Other people are concerned about sort of a noisy factory that's near where they live. So they file a Freedom of Information request for noise complaints. And I think there's a lot of that sort of day in, day out Freedom of Information requests that we often don't see, but is a really important part of the process. And when you look at the statistics on Freedom of Information requests, I think something like half of them are from individuals. And they're not the big sort of front page stories, but they're answering very important questions for those people about the people that they care about, the places that they visit, the neighborhood in which they live.
There's some awkward conversations that have to be had sometimes, and governments obviously are not always incentivized to release information that would lead to those awkward conversations. But nevertheless, citizens want to know. Citizens want to know what's going on in their government, and especially those that don't maybe have a voice within the inner circle of government.
You know, BC has seen its share of scandals, and in every case, often the scandal is more about what the public was not told rather than the subject of the matter in the first place.
I mean, I was struck by something a few months ago here in White Rock where The mayor was quoted in a story in the local paper complaining about how much all the freedom of information requests were costing. And it's the kind of thing I see all the time. And I always get a bit frustrated because I sort of feel like if you're not in the media, you don't understand the importance of the Freedom of Information Act. But the next week, the letters page was full of individual citizens outraged at the mayor that he would call this out, that they sort of said the Freedom of Information Act is extremely important for us to know what's going on in government, and we wouldn't have to file so many Freedom of Information requests if your government wasn't so secretive.
Okay, we know information is power. That's what it's about. Really what we should be doing is looking to government and saying, if there's an access problem, why are you creating it? Don't be afraid of the public. Don't treat the public as though it were some kind of clandestine enemy that's trying to steal your information.
Before I became a journalist, I actually worked as a communications officer for the provincial government. So I got to see secrecy in the provincial government firsthand.
One of the things we aimed for when we developed this legislation was to create a culture of openness, to create a way to ensure that citizens had the information they need to hold government accountable. And it didn't work. Something we never anticipated was that government public servants would move to an oral culture. This just wasn't on our radar when this legislation was developed.
I still remember that when I was a communications officer, being advised to not write down anything that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the Vancouver Sun.
So the combination of not writing down critical information supporting decisions, plus the narrow interpretation of sections like the policy advice exception, the cabinet confidences exception, and Section 25 public interest disclosure provision resulted in citizens not getting the information they needed and deserve. I mean, they paid for the development of this information to hold government accountable.
I think over time, what we've seen is not just a directive to not write stuff down that you wouldn't want to see in a newspaper. What has happened is people have stopped writing things down entirely.
I have in my hand the official record-keeping system for the office. I'm not making this up.
No, you're not. No.
The office of the Premier, when somebody in the public asks for access to information, there's a person in the office. They go around and talk to everybody orally. No records are kept. And if he needs to leave himself a reminder, he uses a Post-it note, which is then put into the shredder or the garbage afterward.
Post-it note is record, so when you rip it off and crumple it up and throw it away because you'd rather not have that lying around, you're actually destroying records.
I wouldn't even try to get some smoking gun email from someone in the Premier's office because I knew it didn't exist. Whereas further down the bureaucracy, that's where you would often find people making comments about, this was a bad decision, I don't agree with this is going to have unintended consequences.
The most reliable records are the financial records. Follow the money all the time. You can establish all the policies you want, but if you don't spend the money on them, the policy basically does not exist. That's the way you find out things, from the financial records. And guess what? It's not authorities and politicians who create the financial records. They are the filer rank below them.
So if I'm an underling, and I think my boss is making a horrible decision, I actually have a very strong incentive to put that in an email.
Some of our reports have identified behaviors such as failure to document important decisions, workarounds of FOI requirements, destruction of records where records really should have existed.
Part of what the commissioner found was that they were just deleting things.
We received a request related to the highway of tears. It said any emails or documents, you're required to run a search of your own computer. I did that and had a whole series of hits, probably about 12 to 18. I alerted our ministerial assistant. He came over to the computer, took a look at the emails really quickly, and told me to delete them. There was no way I was going to do that. He took over my computer and deleted them out of the system.
They delete it 3 times, so get an email off your inbox, then you delete it again out of your trash can, and then you delete it again before 5 o'clock when the government-wide systems would do backups of everything. George Gretas, the man who ultimately was the only person ever charged in relation to this, he was charged with obstructing the commissioner by lying under oath, not for destroying records. If he had gone into the first interview and said, yep, I walked over there and I deleted it, and then I deleted it again, and then I deleted it a 3rd time to make sure it was completely gone, and it's gone, and I did that. What are you going to do about it? That would be it.
There should be a penalty for improperly destroying documents, and that's an important recommendation that my office made to the Legislative Committee reviewing the legislation. So I have called for a duty to document key decisions and key actions of government agencies, and that duty be prescribed in law.
Actually requires a lot of work for an agency not to keep a record. They have to be trying extremely hard to cover up their tracks, to delete emails the second they send them, to put things onto Post-it notes, to have oral meetings where everyone's just supposed to remember what happened, to use their Gmail account instead of their government account. So it speaks to, I think, how secretive these agencies are, that they're going out of their way to not leave a trail when the modern technology that we use today generally creates a trail if you don't tell it otherwise.
That's still, something that the archival science community is working to actually figure out. What does it mean to have proper record-keeping controls in a cloud record-keeping environment, for example? What does it mean when government record-keeping moves on to blockchain technology? How does that look in terms of public records controls and public accountability? Of course, technology moves faster than the law, and sometimes that creates control gaps that break down these public accountability mechanisms and allow, sometimes bad actors, politicians who forget about the public interest, to take advantage of those control gaps.
Everybody with their mobile devices and their laptop computers has become their own records manager. And so what I think needs to happen is let's get back to fundamentals. Let's ensure that the rules are clear and that somebody is enforcing those rules.
In a weird way, what we're really asking about is not a duty to document, but a duty not to delete, right? That a lot of these agencies now are going out of their way to cover their tracks, to delete emails 3 different ways to make sure there's no record of them. In a lot of ways, the duty to document is just like, stop it. Just operate like a normal organization. When you make a decision, it's written down, keep that email so that if anyone wants to know what you're up to, they can ask for it later.
If there is a records officer who is responsible for that in each department and an archivist who is linked to that record office, that's not the problem. The problem is the lack of a machinery for automatic creation of the right records at the right time in the right place. And this creation would have to happen at the hands of a records officer, a third neutral party, not the authority or the politician.
We now have the technology for storing massive amounts of data in perpetuity without ever having to worry about storage space. All we have to worry about is the medium. Can the medium be renewed? So when governments say, we can't do this, it's too much work, it's not too much work. It's work they don't want to do.
People are realizing that there's a lot that you can do with this data, but it's in this digital form, and so there's been a huge uptick in open data initiatives, and this is coupled with proactive disclosure, with demands that governments will just proactively disclose this information through open data portals. We'll just make it all available for citizens to use. And that's a wonderful idea, and we should definitely move toward that. But here's the thing, governments are not always incentivized to reveal information that maybe highlights mistakes they've made, or that highlights policy decisions that have disadvantaged one group over another group.
Archivists have the responsibility for preserving those records that have long-term value to hold governments accountable presently and historically. Historical accountability is a very important issue because we need to learn from the past and not making the same mistakes. And we need to hold the previous generation responsible for what they have done to the following ones. Think climate change, okay?
It is about history. What will happen is they will fill in the history themselves the way they want it filled in. You can't question it because you can't prove, this is why you made that decision. They get the opportunity to say whatever they want. We made this decision because of this, and it could be some complete garbage.
If we fail to document important actions, deliberations, and decisions, then citizens are really cut out of the very important role that they play in a democracy. There is a reason why we have freedom of information rights. There is a reason why we need to retain records. And even beyond FOI, it has to do with good governance. It has to do with good management. Public officials come and go, and where's the corporate memory of the decisions that have been made in the past? Add on to that the need to retain the historical record for all British Columbians to enjoy in the future.
I hope you enjoyed the documentary. Now I would like to introduce to you the panel moderator, Dr. Corinne Rogers, record analyst for Artifactual System and the InterPARES project coordinator. Corinne.
Thank you and welcome to our panel. Each panelist is going to have 2 minutes for a brief statement in response to the video, and then we'll have a brief discussion. And then we'll follow with questions from the audience as time permits. We're scheduled to go to the top of the hour, but we can take an extra 10 or 15 minutes beyond that if necessary. So as an attendee, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the panel to you. Mike Larson is professor and co-chair of criminology at Kwantlen Polytechnic University and president of the BC Freedom of Information Association, or FIPA. Victoria Lemieux is an associate professor of archival studies at the School of Information at the University of British Columbia, and also the head of the Blockchain Research Center, Blockchain at UBC. And Andrew McLeod is the legislative bureau chief at the Tyee and award-winning journalist with years of experience dealing with FOI policy and requests. So welcome to the panelists. And Mike, let's start with you. You've got 2 minutes to give us your opinions.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic from really around the world, and I want to commend the director and the team that put together this documentary. I think it's really important. So this, for many of us who are working in the transparency field, is not new. This kind of challenge, the issues around duty to document, are kind of baked into our systems. And I think that the documentary does a fantastic job of explaining both why why this might be happening and the implications of it in terms of a democratic society. I want to spend just a minute or two talking about where we might go from here, what we need to do around this. And my starting point is that I don't think that we can expect public bodies, government institutions that have a degree of information control and derive power from the ability to control information to voluntarily improve their approach to transparency and to ensure that they're effectively documenting their decisions. What's needed here is a concerted push, really in every jurisdiction at every level, for people to legislate a duty to document, right? For our transparency laws to actually incorporate requirements such that it's impossible for public bodies to engage in the kind of political machinations that were at the heart of the triple delete scandal that's mentioned in the documentary and in others. And this simply requires a process of ensuring that the exercise of any decision-making, exercise of any powers, any kind of commentary by public bodies is effectively documented. And that has to be something that applies at all levels of government. That's a very important point. Although we're focusing here on some very large scandals that have an implication for, let's say, provincial governments or national governments, duty to document is something that affects all public bodies. I work at a university, and it's very important that the decisions made by that public institution are effectively documented. The city of White Rock, as mentioned by Chad Skelton, any municipality, we have to have a solution around duty to document that really affects all levels of government. And we have to ensure that that's part of our culture of public service, that public servants like Tim Duncan, as you saw in the documentary, are able to exercise their good judgment and properly document their work without interference. So decisions, a solution that applies at all levels, and also penalties for failing to effectively do this are the key ingredients that we need to push for. I'll leave it there now. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Vicki.
Hi, hello, greetings, everyone from around the world. It's so exciting to see you all. Oops, can you hear me, Corinne? I just want to make sure I'm not muted.
You're fine.
Perfect. Yeah, so I will just add to the to Mike's comments by saying I'll double down on the need for legislated duty to document. But what I'd really like to focus on as a professor of archival science is that it's not just enough to have the legislation in place. You have to implement it. And that means that we need really strong records and information management infrastructures and mechanisms within government to actually give effect to the legislation. We see all around the world FOI laws that are just, sort of dead letter laws. We have to make them real. We have to breathe life into them. So, we know that effective implementation of right to information laws and open data, for that matter, requires effective records and information management. It's critical. And it's really received a little attention relative to the impact on the effectiveness of transparency initiatives. They depend on having strong practices of records creation, management, and preservation. And this is true all around the world. It's not just true here in BC. Ultimately, it requires that we gather good data about the current state of records and information management needed to benchmark our initial conditions. What's our starting point in terms of the effectiveness of our records and information management, and to track progress. And I will say that the last global survey of the state of records and information management and archives around the world was done in the 1970s by the ICA. So I think we're a little overdue for that. And certainly each jurisdiction needs to look, at its own level of readiness for implementation and effectiveness for implementation. We need to update laws and regulations, as has already been mentioned, for the FOI, but also for the management of government records, for the new digital reality, because they've fallen woefully behind in many jurisdictions. And we need to align incentives in the public service to encourage behavior that supports goals of transparency and public accountability. Finally, it requires independent monitoring, and I really stress this, and oversight of records and information management. practices within government agencies. So it's great to have strengthened infrastructures within the executive branch of government, but that's still within the executive branch of government. And those who are responsible for records management are still bound to the directives of the minister, deputy ministers, and so on. And so we need an independent oversight, because records management is a key public accountability mechanism. And it's not good enough just to have that operating within the executive hierarchy of government. So meaningful dialogue and closer ongoing collaboration between those responsible for transparency and those with responsibility for records and information management needs to happen. It is happening through mechanisms like this. And with stronger records and information management across governments, the data needed to derive accurate, reliable, and authentic records to support transparency and public trust will be achievable. It can be achievable. And I'm so delighted to be a part of this project, because this is really highlighting the need for all of that. So thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Andrew.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for including me in this. I want to give you my view as a reporter, covering mostly British Columbia politics and public policy. I see the job as mostly figuring out how to find things out. There's an old adage that news is what somebody does not want you to know. Everything else is advertising. I think there's some truth in that. Governments are dumping things out all the time. It's like this tsunami of information. I don't think even most reporters understand the degree to which we're being played, sort of having our attention directed one place or another. So FOI is one tool to get around that, it would seem, and it would seem quite a powerful one, to get at the information that governments are reluctant to share or circulate. So as the documentary makes clear, it's a useless law if the records don't exist in the first place, or if officials evade it by deleting files or denying they exist. Probably about 10 years or so ago, I started getting a lot of no records responses, things that I was pretty sure exist. And that's still the case. I had one just in the last few weeks where I was quite confident a document existed, and a thorough search has been conducted, and yet they have nothing to share. Another issue with it is even when there are documents, often they come back heavily severed. I had one recently where it was 14 pages and the only thing that was not deleted was one PowerPoint slide with about 12 words on it, which told me absolutely nothing. So a lot of that is in the act. There are various reasons why they can withhold records and take issue with a lot of them. The other thing, there was a lot of discussion about sort of the move to oral culture, and I've heard that as well. Officials who say that they're pretty smart about not putting things on paper. I think, things like Signal get used, or WhatsApp, for communications that the public would probably be interested in, but that people do, as Elizabeth Denham says, on their personal devices, and nobody's going to know whether they're bringing those forward when they get an FOI request or not. I know of at least one example where the bureaucracy was restructured so that documents could be withheld. There was a part of the finance ministry that did audits of various government programs, and I used to be able to get those through FOI. The reporting structure was changed so it reports to cabinet. So now it's advice to the minister. So it was okay 15 years ago to put that out, but then, with that decision, suddenly all those documents that they're creating, which are of interest to the public, are unavailable. So anyway, the whole system puts applicants who aren't necessarily equipped to deal with it into this legalistic framework with an endless back and forth. We can complain to the Information and Privacy Commission if we don't like the response we get, or a fee or whatever, but it's time consuming. So as a reporter, my calculation is, with the 2 hours it takes me to complain, be better spent doing something else, digging somewhere else, and often it is. And beyond that, my experience with the Commissioner's Office is mixed. My sense is they're overrun. Sometimes they're helpful. Sometimes I've dealt with people there who just seem burnt out as well. The whole thing to me speaks to a culture of secrecy. As Stephen Hume said in the documentary, information is power, and governments tend to hoard it. FOI requests, with all the frustrations that come with them, have become the norm. Public bodies could choose to be a lot more forthcoming, either by proactively disclosing more, And there has been some move to that, or by releasing more just with an informal request. You know, like for the most part, if I call a communications person and say, can you share with me X, they'll say, put an FOI request in, which of course means you're into a waiting period and an argument and all the headaches that come with that. I think along with that, there should be better access to experts and less filtered through the communications people. I agree with the panelists who have said, you know, we need stronger laws, but I don't have a whole lot of faith in that working without sort of a shift in the culture. You know, there needs to be a bias towards transparency. Officials need to remember that they are working for the public, they're paid for by the public, and they're spending the public's money. They need to be reminded of that all the time and act accordingly. My job is to get the story out, and I don't want to complain a whole lot about the hurdles that are put up in the way of that, but you know, the whole culture and information management system could be so much better. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Before we go to the questions that are starting to come in, I'd just like to give the panel as a whole a chance to discuss what each of you has said, and maybe you can just respond to each other.
I can jump in. Absolutely. Well, maybe I'll pick up on what Andrew mentioned there, because it came up several times around this issue of culture. It's difficult to change culture in institutions. This is something I deal with in my other career as an academic, as a criminologist. How do you shift culture in institutions that have a resistance to accountability? And I think it starts with really ensuring that the people who are doing the processing of access to information requests within government bodies know that they have responsibility and that they have autonomy, that they're actually able to do this as part of their job. It strikes me, and I think Andrew probably has seen this as well, that a lot of FOI work is done off the side of a desk. It's under-resourced. It's something that someone is meant to do or expected to do in addition to their job. The training is actually quite inadequate in terms of the purpose and intentions of the law. So really addressing some of those things and shoring up the actual capacity of public servants to fully discharge their responsibilities here, I think, is a really key component of any solution.
Yeah, maybe just jumping in on that point too. It's also about aligning incentives and making sure that, you know, if you're trying to change the culture, that people are incentivized to behave. Their behavior, what incentivizes their behavior is aligned with the culture that you want to create. The other point I think relating to culture is that there's a library scientist who is actually the originator of the concept of social epistemology, who has articulated, Jess Shira is this academic's name, wrote in the 1970s and said, you know, we create our culture through our records. So they give us a shared meaning and understanding. So what I think governments don't understand is that, you know, by denying access to records, not creating records, they're actually undermining the culture and the unity of the society. So it's kind of a way of saying we don't trust the people who have elected us. We don't trust our citizenry. It's a kind of a spiraling lack of trust, you know, to the bottom. And that does diminish the culture. It does diminish the civility of society, if you will, and our shared understanding and meaning. So governments have to trust their own people more in order for us to trust our governments.
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that I believe a great shift in culture is coming. My point is just that, you know, even the laws we have that are insufficient, they don't follow well. So it does require that sort of good faith. And I do think, yes, it should be shored up with better laws and you know, as you say, aligning the incentives so that people feel they can, you know, create records and share them when the FOI request comes in and that sort of thing. But at the same time, like it takes a certain security of the government to and maturity maybe to allow for that, and trust, as you say. I would also observe that, you know, governments, well, political parties, when they're in opposition, tend to be all for freedom of information laws. You know, the NDP, who are the government now, when they were in opposition, they pressed for all kinds of changes that would be in line with what the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association were asking for, and lots of us who use the system were asking for. They've been government for 3 years now, a little more. You know, they seem to have forgotten about it. And in fact, when they were reelected, I had a story about how the mandate letter to the Citizen Services Minister, who's responsible for the system, they dropped improving the freedom of information laws from that. So 2017, it had been in the letter, you know, we want you to improve the freedom of information laws. This time around, in November's letter, it wasn't there. So yeah, when governments are in power, they tend to shift their view on this stuff, sadly.
Let's go to the questions. This first question, Vicki, I'm going to pose to you. How has the pandemic and the need for coordinated responses at all levels of government affected this oral culture? Has the pandemic revealed or magnified the weaknesses of oral culture, and has it reinforced its value and provided cover?
Yeah, yes, that's a very, very good question and timely. And sad to say, I think the answer to that is yes. You know, there's so many examples around the world of where COVID-19 is being used to provide cover. And you know, maybe I can start with just a couple of examples. Here in British Columbia, you know, we had the biggest post-World War II cabinet formed in March of last year. And, you know, it met the day before the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus pandemic. And so I'm told no minutes were kept of that cabinet meeting. And, you know, maybe that's a cabinet confidence that we wouldn't immediately have access to. But, you know, as an archivist, it's shocking to think that there would be no record of something that has such a momentous impact on our society, the history of British Columbia. And this is unfortunately a pattern repeated all around the world. In Australia, for example, a Senate committee was examining the Australian government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and has drawn attention to multiple claims of public interest immunity. So I'm sorry, it's not in the public interest for us to disclose that information. Or the other thing is, you know, there would be a competitive disadvantage to doing that, you know, sort of around contracts for COVID vaccines. The problem with that is that, you know, it leaves people guessing. And it makes people wonder what has been negotiated away. And so I think that, you know, these you know, attempts to kind of, you know, it's in the public interest not to disclose this and to conceal a lot of this information or keep it secret for now are really counterproductive at a time when people need to understand why decisions are made, you know, and choices are made in order to feel confident and trust that those are the right decisions and comply with some of the very strict measures that are being issued by governments, or to understand, you know, why certain things are happening with COVID and vaccines and apps and so on. So unfortunately, the answer is yes. What we have to make sure is that this doesn't become a permanent condition. I'll end on that.
Thank you. The next question, I think, Andrew, I'm going to pose to you. It touches on what you were mentioning about the party in power feeling differently than the party in opposition. Do you think the duty to document and the duty to not delete have become politicized to become part of the specific political party agendas, rather than being a topic towards which political ideologies should converge? And if so, what are the strategies to turn these duties as a matter that different political ideologies can agree
on? Yeah, I mean, my sense is that the different parties we have in BC basically agree on it. It's a good idea when they're in opposition, and it's a bad idea when they're in government. I don't know how you change that. I mean, I guess having the kinds of discussions we're having today, you know, continuing to give it attention. Certainly, the commissioners voice on it is loud and welcome. I think continuing that discussion and basically shaming them into it. There does need to be public support for it and public press for it. I do think. I've been covering provincial politics for a while, and I'm not so cynical to take the position that things don't change. Things do change, but usually it's when there's either something's gone wrong, and there's significant public pressure or support for it. I think if you polled the public on this, most would agree with the kinds of things we're talking about today. But again, it's hard for a government in power sometimes to do those things. Often it's when governments first come to power. So I think we got the Freedom of Information Act in early 90s when the NDP had first come to power after many years of SOCRED rule. And then the other thing is when governments are on the way out, sometimes they have an incentive to strengthen these laws. But it's been a while since we've seen that. I'm not sure I gave a very good answer there, but that's my general rambling view of it.
No, I think that's great. Mike or Vicky, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I'd echo what Andrew said, and to the point that people are interested in this. People have a stake in transparency. Our organization, the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, routinely does polling of the public around issues around privacy and information rights, and we can confirm that people are interested, very much so, in transparency, and governments understand this as well. I dropped a link in the group chat here to some responses from political parties to a questionnaire around transparency in the context of a previous provincial election. All political parties understand the importance of speaking the language of transparency, and especially when they're in opposition, when it's the other guys who are the ones that are being secretive, right? But it's actually carrying through with that as a matter of an agenda that is consistently lacking in just about every jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's often when they, I think, as Andrew said, it's when political parties are either just coming in or on their way out that we see some shifts, because they know they'll be on the other side and on the opposition, and they'll use it as a tool to get information that they need to criticize the government in power. So this is the way that it is. Would that it were different, but I think we have to accept that it is a dance. It isn't, a journey with a necessary and end point.
This next question, I think each of you might have slightly different responses to, so I'm interested to hear what each of you has to say. Which government is currently leading the way in creating a true, open, and transparent government, and how are they doing that? So, Vicky, maybe I could put that to you to begin with.
Well, that's a hard one to answer, because there's so many ways in which you could answer that. I would refer people who are interested to the Center for Law and Democracy's Right to Information Index, where they are evaluating the strength of RTI laws around the world. And they have a number of different data points that they look at. They're also working with individuals around the world to look at the strength of implementation of those laws. And this is to try and see how far we have to go before we can actually realize the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 1610.2, which calls for legislated public access to information. So there's a lot of different ways that we could look at that. In terms of the duty to document, though, we can look at a couple of jurisdictions where the duty to document has been legislatively implemented. So in the United States, there has been law passed, and New Zealand and some Australian states as well. So here in British Columbia, the BC government is very proud of the fact that there is a legislative duty to document. But here's the rub with that particular legislative duty. It's in the records and the new Information Management Act. And it's the use of the language may rather than shall, which really kind of takes the bite out of it. So it's like, yeah, you might want to keep some records versus, yeah, you shall keep records. Big difference there. In these other jurisdictions, the legislative duty to document is of the you shall variety. And I think we need to give thought here in this jurisdiction to, to strengthening the legislative duty of document. Maybe it needs to be in both the our freedom of information legislation as well as in our records and information management law, because as I said, there's the records and information management function reports up through the executive branch of government. And so, if there's something is going wrong, there's no mechanism necessarily for that to surface, whereas you wanted independent oversight. And where the information commissioners can come in, I think, and provide that is if they have, if it's also in the freedom of information law, as well as giving the information commissioner right to investigate complaints about, avoidance of record-making oral government, skirting the record-keeping rules and those sorts of things, and then clear sanctions. So I guess I can point to some jurisdictions that are getting it better. It's a very multidimensional question. So, we have a long way to go in a lot of jurisdictions around the world. And as I was mentioning in response to the previous question, we've actually gone backwards. Many big, democracies are really failing citizens. Yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah, I would just I don't have a whole lot to add. I would mention the one thing with the Information Management Act and putting the duty to document in there. I mean, Mike could probably tell you more, but I think it covers what, 42 public bodies where there was some push to put that into the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy Act instead, which applies to something like 2,900 public bodies. So just making, aside from all the enforcement, everything else, this making sure it applies widely is key. And other than that, I mean, I'm pretty focused on BC, which I think I've probably given my view fairly clearly on how it's working here. I occasionally make a federal access to information request as well. For the most part, I found them more helpful, but I don't know if it's just a small sample size that I was lucky on the ones I put in. I do hear from others that there are headaches there. I did have one that took 2.5 years or something. Before they eventually turned over what I wanted. So, it's my impression is the federal government's not great either. And then I don't, and then Victoria gave a better view of what's happening internationally. So thank you.
Mike, any jurisdictions you think are doing well?
I think jurisdictions where you do see a legislative duty to document embedded in the transparency law itself, Mexico is one example where you have this, it's directly spoken to in the act as opposed to in a separate information management act. And that's worth underscoring, actually. I think one of the challenges we see here is that getting a duty to document in a place like British Columbia requires action by the provincial government. So the provincial government always conceptualizes this in relation to provincial politics, right? So it's about the provincial government, its power, positions between parties. But the issue, of course, is we need a duty to document that applies to all levels of government. So when the provincial government's considering the freedom of information legislation, it has an impact on the city where I live, right? It has an impact on community library associations, and it has an impact on all sorts of levels of government. So I think some of those bodies, so some of those public bodies actually have a better culture around transparency and duty to document, precisely because they're not as implicated in the political churn where this issue tends to get stymied at the provincial level.
Interesting, thank you. Vicki, about cloud storage. So this question is about cloud storage of records. What happens when the jurisdiction of the international companies that offer these services, and how is authenticity and provenance assured in that case?
Well, that's a tricky question. I think what the proposer of the question is getting at is that authenticity and provenance is not assured in these environments. You can put documents into the cloud, and we don't really know, with great certainty in some cases, whether those documents have been manipulated, whether deliberately or just by dint of, if they've been altered by dint of some kind of process that has been run upon them. They can be planted in different cloud stores. We've got so many instances of data breaches happening. And I'll just give you one instance recently from COVID-19 where the European Medicines Agency had received information from producers of vaccines, and there was a data breach of that vaccine data. And the purpose of the data breach wasn't so much to get access to the data, but to manipulate it and then to release it into the public to sow public distrust. So I think, what we see happening in the world around us is through digital technologies that are now being used to create and store records, we see a lot of questions around, who's really got access to these records? How secure are they? Where do they actually come from? And that's why we need to train our students, which we're doing at the University of British Columbia, in how to understand what is an authentic and trustworthy record. And we need these properly trained individuals to be responsible for records and information management in situations where we do need a high degree of trust in our records, as we do in public sector environments. So, I think some of the new technologies that I'm looking at, for example, such as blockchain, which can be used as a check. The government of Estonia, for example, for a long time has used blockchain or distributed ledger technology to ensure the integrity of its records against manipulation of data. And so this is quite a good use case for blockchain technology. So we need to look to new ways of doing things, but be aware, of the environment that we currently live in, and that records are at risk.
Thank you. So now I've got a bit of a controversial, it's as much a comment as a question. I'll pose it as a question to you. So a little devil's advocate here. The documentary understandably focuses on some evident government misdeeds, but as records professionals, we need to see another side of the coin and state or recognize that transparency is only good perhaps in moderation. Every medicine in excessive doses turns poison. So valid needs of government agencies, for example, for informal conversations and brainstorming off the record, are not considered. Excessive transparency actually provokes bad record creating and keeping practices. What are your opinions on that?
Well, so this is the balance between transparency and, in secrecy of deliberations, for example. And, as I was just saying, we live in a world where there are bad actors. And so that information that becomes accessible could be used against the society that, to undermine its institutions. So we can't be naive about this. And we do have exceptions to account for some of those circumstances. But I would always lean on the side of transparency. I think that, if there's if information has come out and there's confusion about that information, then providing more explanation and accounting solves the problem, explains the decision making and the circumstances. So I don't think that we should be hiding around behind a blanket of secrecy and blaming transparency for the lack of trust. The lack of trust, comes from doing untrustworthy things, and and if you can't properly account for yourself, then you should think about, what maybe not doing those things that, make it difficult to account for what you've done. So I'm always leaning on the side of transparency. It is the way in which we, as I said, we build a joint, we structure society, and we build a shared meaning and trust throughout society. Without that, we just have, we just have darkness.
As a reporter, I'm always going to lean on the side of transparency as well. The big question with that is who judges, right? And you can just look at different governments around the world, and Joe Biden might look at it one way, Justin Trudeau might look at it another, and China or North Korea might look at it another way. And I'm not sure I want to trust the officials to decide what gets out and what doesn't. As a reporter, there is huge value in seeing what's going on in the decision making. For instance, we had one a few years ago where there was a home buyers plan announced that was going to give money to first-time home buyers, and the day it was announced, I was pretty sure that people within the government probably thought it was a bad idea. So I FOI'd all that stuff at the provincial end and FOI'd at the federal end, and got some stuff out of the federal end where it was clear that like the CMHC was telling the provincial government that they were basically there were informal emails saying this is idiotic. Provincial government managed to shut it down and never released anything of any substance on it. But to me, would be huge value in knowing, did a government, knowingly put in a program that its own advisors were advising against? And again, I don't really want the people who decided to go ahead with the program despite the advice deciding on whether or not those records get released. But that may, of course, be a reporter's eye view, and maybe Orwell's 1984. Maybe the society did work smoother with the control that was put on release of records. Anyway, thank you.
I can jump on this one too. It's too provocative not to. It's a good question, right? I mean, I think it's important to ask the devil's advocate question. I've got 3 responses though. So one is that duty to document is really a separate issue from the actual mechanism of transparency itself, right? It is the process that actually creates the records about which there can be debates around transparency and secrecy and access and so on. But if they're not created in the first place as kind of a proactive secrecy, then you lose that capacity to go back and look at the archival records. So even when there are reasonable grounds for there to be discussions that take place that are not subject to transparency laws, and again, I tend to lean on the side of transparency kind of vocationally, but even if that's the case, those decisions still need to be documented. Those still need to be part of a record. And I think the best practice really is that even those kinds of records or those closed door deliberations should become public after a period of time, right? And that's, there can be debates about what that time period is. The other thing I would say about this is that it's not that the problem is getting worse, I would say. I think that's one of the issues we need to understand, is that for people who have been using access to information law for a long time, you used to get email chains back in I can think in the early 2000s, where there were actually really interesting, frank conversations. There were issues put on the table. There was an evidence basis for a debate that took place. And that wasn't all subject to kind of gotcha style, smoking gun type exposés, but it did give you a sense of where people were coming from and some of the issues that were being debated. And now it's so common to get an email that simply says, "Call me." Right? And the conversation takes place offline. So that whole issue around whether there are valid grounds for there to be, opacity within government needs to be couched in the fact that the problem is getting worse, not better.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the poser of that question. I am aware that we're now at 5 minutes past the hour. And so I'm going to ask one more question and then perhaps let the panelists say any last words before I then thank the panelists and turn things back over to Luciana. So the last question I want to ask is, are there any resources online or books that each of you of the panel might recommend for further understanding and gaining knowledge regarding FOI in Canada? Your favorite resources. Andrew, let's start with you.
Yeah, there's nothing that floats to mind right off the top. I mean, I think there's lots online. Like I think Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, Mike's organization, does a great job of making stuff available. Probably there's more academic than popular things. I can't think of a popular book off the top, but that may be just because I'm on the spot. I'm sure 5 minutes from now, maybe I will. Yeah, but and just on closing thoughts, yeah, thank you for putting this documentary forward and bringing up all the issues and for having this discussion. And I hope we'll find ways to continue it going forward. So thank you.
Definitely, yeah. Mike?
There's a lot of stuff out there. I think Andrew's point that a lot of it's more academic or specialist oriented is a really important one in terms of public facing stuff. Our organization, BC FIPA, does have quite a bit in the way of resources, a lot of it based on particular issues, so you can check that out. I did a book some years back called Brokering Access, which was with UBC Press, and it included commentary from journalists, academics, activists around their experiences using transparency laws and some of the challenges they face. So that's, I think, another useful resource for you. And then for the how-to type stuff, there's a couple things out there if people are interested in, and I really think the best way to understand this issue is actually to just jump in and start filing access requests and seeing what is available. FIPA has some resources available on our website, and there's also a book called Your Right to Know by Bronsko and Mackey as journalists who talk about their efforts there. And thank you again. It's been wonderful to be on the panel and to talk about this. I'm excited that in 2021, we can actually have this many people together for a conversation about transparency. I think that bodes well.
Great, thank you. Vicki, I see that you've added a couple of things to the chat, and I've also added a few things to the chat as Mike was talking. If others have resources they'd like to add to the chat, that would be a great place to record them. Vicki, is there anything else that you want to particularly highlight as a resource?
Yeah, so I've put in the link for the Center for Law and Democracy that I mentioned previously. It's not specific to British Columbia. They look more at the national level than the subnational level, but it's a very, very useful resource if you want to get a global picture. And a couple years ago, while I was on leave from UBC to do some research on the right to information at the World Bank, I wrote with my colleague Stephanie Trapnell a book on public access to information, and it talks about implementing the laws. And so if people are interested in the question of how you go about implementing the laws and where things stand with that, I think that that book is available through the World Bank's knowledge repository. It's open source, so you can just Google it, and you can just download it and use it, which is great. Yeah, I would just add thanks again to InterPARES for producing this and for being part of this project, and say that InterPARES itself, and I don't know if you put the link to the InterPARES project on the in the chat, but for those of you who aren't aware, InterPARES has produced an enormous amount of research that looks at questions of transparency and open data, but more specifically on trust and trustworthiness in records. So that's also all open source and an extremely valuable resource globally. And yes, I, like Mike, am very happy and heartened that there's so many people around the world that have joined us for this conversation. And I'm so glad that we still live in a world where we can have this conversation. Let us continue this fight while we can, because if we don't, we won't be able to meet like this and have these kinds of conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Vicki and Andrew and Mike. And I just want to highlight that Mike is going to be interviewed on CBC AM radio at noon today. If you want to hear more about this, you can continue your listening. And now I'm going to, again, say thank you to the panelists and turn this back over to Luciana for her final words and farewell.
Hello again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. To close, I would like to thank the panelists and the moderator for their contributions to this event, and you all for your attention and participation. The response to this event has been phenomenal. We had well above 500 participants, so stay tuned for other events in the future. All the best, everyone.